Okay, hello everyone. Hope you had a great weekend. Getting ready for the final stretch run. Last week classes today. Our two plans are for today. We're gonna try to basically go over everything we talked about in the entire semester. So today's basically gonna be the giant review day, where we sort of try to put all that Taylor stuff together with all the stuff we've been doing in the second half of the course. Um, Probably it'll take us a good chunk. I don't know if it'll take us the whole 70 minutes or whatever, but probably at least take us a pretty good chunk of time. And then on Thursday, we'll end the semester up with just sort of little course overview kind of deal, talk some course business, go over any paper issues people have, any questions people want to talk about the paper. Remember, the paper is due on May 12th, which I believe is Thursday of final week. Is that correct? No, Tuesday of finals week. Right, so it's due May 12th to Tuesday of finals week. Extensions are possible, but not very long extensions because I do have to get everything graded pretty soon. So if you need an extension, let me know and we can probably work something out. But yeah, and I'm not going to, just so everyone knows in advance, I'm not going to write comments on these papers during my first run through. My goal is just going to be to get them graded as soon as possible, get all the grades submitted and everything, because in addition to this class, I have papers due in a bunch of other classes too. But if anyone does want comments, I'm not at all adverse to writing them. I'll just send me an email, let me know you want comments, and then I'll write them as soon as I get all my grades actually inputted for the semester. So have the getting done with the business first, and then can do the philosophically interesting stuff. So that's my plan for those papers. Does anyone have any questions about the papers or any other last little bits of business for the course? All right. I think I still have one more daily assignment to grade, but once I get that one done, everything should be in except for this last draft of paper. And this last draft is worth a little bit more than the earlier ones. So it's, for good or ill, potentially, I suppose, but this last one's worth a little bit more. Good. Any other questions or thoughts, anything before we get going, or should we just get going with our giant review project? Someone's asking in the chat, how does the dropping of the lowest daily assignment scores work? Canvas does it automatically. So if you look in your Canvas gradebook, there should be basically some sort of like yellow or sort of orangey colored in squares. Those are ones that are getting dropped. So you should be automatically just seeing the lowest two of your scores should be getting dropped. If something doesn't look right, if it doesn't look like it's working, just let me know and I'll try to see what, if anything, is going on or not going on, as the case may be. Any others? All right. So I know it doesn't feel like it, but it's actually only been 5 months since we actually started this semester. Right? To me, it feels like it maybe been a year or two. Might have been a year or two since we just switched online. In fact, but so it actually hasn't been that long, all things considered. So let's maybe go back a little bit and try to figure out what it is we've done, what it is we've done throughout this entire semester. So this probably is not a great shock to any of you. I'm not super satisfied with how people normally talk about religion. I don't think people are very careful about and that depth and care is needed and could be added. That's probably by this point in the semester, I hope, not shocking to anyone. And so that's what we've been in effect doing. We've in effect been trying to set it up so that you all could seriously ask the question, what is religion and how should human beings be related to religiosity in the course of their life? Right? Ask that question in sort of a real sense, with it being a real, vibrant, meaningful question. That's at least the hope, that's at least the goal. So we began in sort of service of this goal with Taylor. And we spent the whole first half of the semester, indeed, working on sorry, what's not working? There we go. Spent the whole first half of the semester just working on Taylor, trying to get through his sort of historical account of sort of how we've gotten to the point that moderns have gotten to. You think of it, I sort of wanted us to start the semester off almost just realizing that our particular modern understanding of what religion is kind of just a historical accident. Like, it's not one that people would have held for the overwhelming majority of human history, and it's not one that's particularly necessary to hold either. It's just one we happen to hold as a result of a whole host of various sorts of sort of historical circumstances. So Taylor's particular goal is to sort of figure out what's going on with what he calls secularism. What is it and how did it become possible? Right? Sort of a weird orientation, I guess, but if you wanted, one way you can frequently try to figure out what something is to figure out what it isn't. And so secularism is in some sense supposed to be some sort of threat to religiosity. At least this is how many people in modernity talk, both from the religious side and also from the atheist side, right? So from both sides, they sort of talk of the secularism as being this threat to religion of a certain sort, whether you're celebrating that or bemoaning it, right? But it's sort of that's a sort of shared commonality. So how did this secularism thing emerge? And how did it become possible for it to emerge? What had to be true? Because no one historically would have been secular until maybe 300 years ago, probably more like 2 or 150 even. So how did this actually become possible? Okay, well, what is it, first of all? It is possible now, Taylor says, for the, I'm going to speak super broadly, he called this sort of, talked about this in a lot of different ways, fullness or meaning of, let's just call it the meaning of life. For today, it's the easiest way. The meaning of life, the reason why you live, what makes all the time that living is sort of sucky, bearable. Right? The meaning of life, it is now possible for people to look for this and to find it only within a mundane, normal, everyday sense of happiness. So I have no grand ambitions besides things going reasonably well in the course of my life, right? So I get married, have some kids, have a decent job, maybe go vacation in Florida every once in a while, get some sun, right? Then go home, go do a lot more working stuff, hope that's not too odious, and then eventually get old and die. And that's it. I'm not looking for or seeking any meaning beyond that sort of just normal everydayness. And all I'm trying to do is get that normal everydayness to work as reasonably well as possible, right? You know, to not get hit by buses, to not get the coronavirus, and to not lose all my money, right? If that's going on, things are going pretty well. I'm not looking for anything beyond this. This is now possible for people. It's not necessary, because a great many people continue to look for this meaning of life in something transcendent. And these are the religious, right? This is religion. This is how basically how Taylor has defined religion. Religion is something that looks for the meaning of life, the nature of human happiness, fulfillment in a transcendent source, right? Or at the very least, in something beyond the normal. And this is what he was calling spirituality, right? So spirituality tends to not be particularly oriented or interested in transcendental sources. It's not necessarily oriented in any sort of group or communal activity. It's sort of another feature of religion, is that it involves something communal in many cases, at least. But at the very least, still these people who are spiritual but not religious are still nevertheless looking for something more than just ordinary everydayness. And so you have all of these possibilities, and this is what secularism is. We have all these possibilities being living possibilities, not just sort of theoretical postulates, but concrete, real ways that people can live. So two sides of this. On the one hand, these are all ways that people are in fact living, but there are also ways that even people who aren't living one route can imagine living the other route. The religious can imagine not being religious, can imagine looking for things just in the mundane everydayness. Those looking for the mundane everydayness might occasionally feel a pull toward God, or maybe both of them are going to wonder that something's missing from both and feel a pull toward maybe a new age spirituality, maybe in the form of something like Buddhism or something like that. Right? We can all sort of imagine these as options for ourselves, and again, how vivid this imagination is varies, right? There are some parts of the country where it's very nearly unthinkable to imagine leaving the Christian church of your family, but very nearly unthinkable is not the same as you can't think of it. Similarly, right, there are people who are raised in a milieu where the possibility of joining one of the Orthodox mainline churches is almost unthinkable. But again, almost unthinkable is not unthinkable, right? It's at least to some minimal extent possible for everyone, right? And this is a new development. At most goes back maybe 200 years or so. And even that's probably a stretch. 200 years ago, it maybe was an option for certain elites. It being an option for most everyone in society, Taylor thinks that's new. That's maybe 100 years, or maybe even less than that. All right. So again, I'm just gonna pause every time we go through a step. So how are we doing so far? Everyone good? Good so far. Nothing's new going to be new today, right? This is all going to be stuff we've done before, just going over again. So anyone want to raise any questions, thoughts about anything within that first step? All right, then let's continue. All right, so how did we get here? If this is the new modern condition, how did we get to it? And that's what Taylor is predominantly concerned with. He's predominantly concerned with answering that question. How did we get to secularism? How did this emerge as a possibility? And the story that he's going to tell, at least, is the story of 500-ish years. We're going to go back to 1500. 1500 is when things are going to change. Right? So what was before that then? Let's start there. So in the medieval world, say about 1,000 to 1,500 or so. We don't have to define it more precisely. Probably it's a little bit earlier than that, but whatever. That rough stretch of time. All right. There was a certain features of life that made secularism, and even just this possibility. So this possibility, this first one, was what Taylor was calling exclusive humanism. That's what he sort of called this first possibility. Exclusive humanism was unthinkable. For anything other than very rare sort of fringe weirdos. There've always been random fringe weirdos who can think weird stuff. That doesn't mean that it's any sort of living possibility for the overall majority of society, or even indeed that it was that would have been a possibility even for most of the elites, right? You had a few weirdo Epicureans floating around or whatever, but this was not something that could have been thought of by most people. So why? What were some of the features of the medieval world? So the medieval world, first of all, understood itself in terms of what an enchanted universe. So the sources of meaning and power within the world, these things are not solely present or features of the human mind. Rather, they are sacred sites, locations, and objects. And these forces, various kinds of forces, have real influence and control over human life. Get the idea of getting possessed by a demon is not something that merely is reserved for horror movies that we use to blow off steam. it is indeed a real living existential terror for me that I could indeed get possessed by some demonic force that will destroy my eternal soul, right? Or at least corrupt it in some fundamental sense. Right? And not just this, right? There are various sorts of objects that can protect me from demonic forces, and there are various objects that can make me vulnerable to those demonic forces. Similarly, there are various kinds of locations that are places of safety, but there are also indeed locations that are sites of enormous danger, right? Sites where the magic, or sites of the Fae, where indeed me getting taken away to the Fae realm is indeed not at all an impossibility, right? So a magical world. And as a result of being magical, at least in part, a hostile world, right? Not all parts of it are hostile, but at least some parts of the world are indeed quite hostile to me. If this is how you understand the world, and indeed even the best of people, even the highest of the elites, outside of, again, certain weirdo theologians and philosophers, right? If you're understanding the world in sort of more or less these terms, then the idea of abandoning Christianity makes very little sense, because Christianity is the source of salvation. So Christianity is a source of white magic that can save you from the sort of hostile forces in the world. And this isn't just something that's true of me as an individual. This is something that's true of society as a whole. Like, this isn't just, this is a fundamentally a social thing. Right? The performance of Christian rights is indeed the organizing principle of communities. And so as a result of this, you're encountering God everywhere, right? You're encountering God in the course of going to work. You encounter God in the course of going to church. You encounter God in the course of growing your crops, though, because God's going to protect the crops through the rituals. Specific festivals, through everything, you're sort of seeing God everywhere. This is not going to invite a kind of secular understanding of things. Similarly, as sort of closely related to these first three points are all pretty closely related to one another. The understanding of the self was one as being sort of porous. Since the universe is enchanted, the self is, in a sense, porous, open, and vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, vulnerable to us has a very harsh sound, and it's just because we're precisely moderns, right? Being vulnerable is actually potentially a good thing, because it means, for example, not only are you potentially open to demonic possession, but you're also open to Christ entering within you, or the Holy Ghost entering within you and redeeming you of sin. Right? This openness is precisely a good thing. This being vulnerable is precisely a good thing. All right. As a result of this, however, there's going to need to be different speeds of religious life. Oh, actually, before we do the different speeds, let me do one other thing first. So again, similarly related to some of these previous points, let's do one thing before we get to since we're encountering God everywhere, we're also therefore constantly encountering a kind of a different understanding of time. Right? This is sort of the secular time is the time of the day-to-day life, but also kinds of eternal time too. And in the cases of these eternal times, we're related to transcendent things in a far more direct and lived sense than we are in the course of normal everyday. Right? On the day of Easter, we are quite literally, through the festivals, through the rituals that are performed, we are, so to speak, right there at the moment of the resurrection. Right? It's now no longer 2,000 years, 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago in time. Now we are right there present with it through this kind of eternal sense of time in which we all sort of live while we're living our normal lives. I mean, you sort of think of this as sort of just a repetition. Life as sort of just a repetition of one Christian story, right? That just repeats itself over and over and over again, right? And this isn't only a Christian thing. This sort of it's intervention of the eternal, Taylor thinks was a hallmark of all pre-modern societies. And the example thing we actually read in class was how this was at play in Egyptian mythology, and indeed it is. It's in play in various facets of Greek thought and so forth, right? This would have been a common sort of way. So let's just pause for a second. All right, how are we doing so far? Again, any of these anyone wants to go over any more? Any questions, comments, thoughts about anything? All right, let's keep it going then. All right. There's a couple other features of this medieval world that made secularism sort of just hard to imagine. There are different speeds of religious life. During this time, this is present. The word religion, so it is indeed an Old English word, religios, that does indeed start to emerge in this time frame. Right? It does start to be start to get used, but it's used just like the older Latin religiosio gets used as a word to describe someone who takes holy vows. Someone who takes more than a usual level of and who promises to take more than a usual level of devotion to Christianity. Right? So everyone is Christian, not everyone is religious. You got a chat question here. What's the difference between the enchanted universe and a transcendental world? This is a really good question. The enchanted universe, all of these sort of magical forces, they do not at least have to be transcendent forces. Okay? So the sort of fae, so the sort of spirits that people in Northern Europe were worried about, these were not gods or anything like that. These were very much things present within the world. These are little powerful little fairies that had the ability to do things to you. And God could protect you from them, right? So God's power is sort of transcendent, and that's why his power ultimately sort of exceeds the power of all the sort of spirits and ghosts and goblins of the world. But these ghosts and goblins of the world, some of them perhaps maybe would be understood in a transcendent sense, but many of them would not have been. And so that's sort of the difference. This is just power in the natural world itself. So you can think of it, the enchanted universe is a description of the natural world, not of a necessarily transcendent or supernatural world. Right? The enchanted universe becomes supernatural once we start saying there are no ghosts, there are no goblins, there are no ghouls. Right? Then we say the natural world doesn't include any of this stuff. And so if you're talking about any of this stuff, you're talking about something supernatural, something beyond the scope of the natural order. So I hope that was a helpful answer. Follow it up though if you've got some more. And so, okay, so we have these, what are these different speeds? There's two basic things, right? We have what Taylor was calling sort of the higher speed of religious life. This is where you sort of devote yourself entirely to the Christian ideal. And so therefore you leave the course of ordinary life behind, right? The most common version of this was people who just take monastic vows of some sort, right? And so therefore no longer concerned with the normal day-to-day. Right? If you take a vow of chastity, you're not going to be doing the whole having kids thing, right? Or getting married thing. If you take a vow, or and indeed, really, you won't be doing any of the whole sex thing in its entirety with something you're just going to be letting go, right? If you take a vow of poverty, you're not going to be doing the whole wealth thing, right? And indeed, if you take any sort of monastic vow, right, you're precisely not going to be living in the normal way people normally live. You're going to, at the very minimum, be living in a sequestered monastery. And so that this is sort of a higher speed, right? This is where you're sort of fully committing to it. And if you're fully committing then to something transcendent and entirely leaving the worldly behind. Conversely, you've got these slower speeds where you have people who are still Christians, still go to Christian churches, still minimally take part in Christian rites, though we'd be stunned by how little they actually did. Taylor sort of constantly brings this point up. And for these people at the slower speed, the role of Christianity in their life is it's predominantly supplying them with the white magic that precisely aids in the course of ordinary life, right? The white magic is precisely like, it's going to heal you when you're sick. It's going to keep you from falling victim to a love spell by someone. It's going to, you know, things of that sort, right? That's precisely things at the sort of speed of normal everyday life, just going to make an ordinary everyday life better. All right. Yeah, so I think is there anything else I wanted to say about this medieval period? I don't think so. All right, so that's our medieval period. Again, as I always sort of joke in medieval philosophy, the medieval period is far more distant and odd to us than anything you ever saw in Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is far more reflecting our way of seeing the world than it reflects a medieval way of seeing the world. It could not be more different. So what happens? How do we go from that, where secularism just is unthinkable, right? Everything sort of points toward the transcendent, and it points toward it in both, amongst both speeds, right? For people who are taking the religious route, obviously they're entirely oriented toward the transcendent. But even those who are fundamentally concerned just with the mundane everyday happiness, they too are oriented toward the transcendent, because it will be God who sort of offers the support needed to live a normal mundane life in the proper way, right? Who can sort of give you the protection that you need to not get possessed by a demon or get taken by a fae. So good so far. All right. Let's see where things start to break down. Come on, why is this not working? Everything changes, 1500s-ish, when things start to shift to what Taylor calls a disciplinary society. And now we're going to start going quickly. We'll start taking these steps a little bit faster. The disciplinary society, right, is where now all of a sudden, both as a result of pressures within Christianity itself, but also as a result of pressures from outside of Christianity, we're going to try to get everyone up to a higher speed. And so and this is especially true as a result within Protestant countries. The spread is far faster in places where Protestantism takes hold. Right, but it also emerges for sort of political reasons, because we're tired of the sort of economic liability it is that our nobles keep murdering themselves in the streets during fighting honor duels. It emerges because we need more industrious workers, and our workers aren't industrious, for non-religious reasons, but it also emerges for religious reasons too, right? thinking that everyone's immortal soul is at stake here. It's not just the monks, right? Everyone's soul is at jeopardy. And so therefore, everyone should be fundamentally concerned with the higher speeds. Right. Now, since it's not possible for everyone to become a monk, or none, that's just not possible for reasonably obvious reasons. Most people just, I mean, if nothing else, society would collapse, but also people don't have, most people just aren't that committed to it. It wouldn't work, right? This is going to mean eliminating the sort of the higher vocations. And indeed, Luther and Calvin are strenuous in their hatred of monasticism. Right? Their vehement hatred of it is sort of legendary. Right? And so sort of bringing both the higher and lower kind of into a middle. And this middle, it's more devout than the average person probably would have been in the Middle Ages. I mean, the extent of sort of outpourings of piety amongst the laity during in many of the Protestant countries is indeed quite impressive. So it's more devout than the average person probably was prior to this, but far more oriented toward the mundane and the everyday than the higher speeds were previously. So this is a huge shift, right? Now everyone is, now you put it in a sense, everyone who's going to be Christian is now going to have to be religious, which previously only the highest of the highest level practitioners would be. Right? And so now which means that the highest level of practice is going to have to go down, but everyone's going to have to live up to a higher standard as a result. Right? So part and parcel of this sort of step is therefore this goes hand in hand with the scientific revolution. Happening at basically the exact same time, simultaneously eliminates the enchanted universe. And replaces it with a sort of universe governed by indifferent impersonal laws. Right? But at least at the time, this in and of itself wasn't seen as a threat to amongst religious institutions. Indeed, religious institutions frequently welcomed this, because we can now get rid of all the goofy white magic stuff. We can sort of relegate white magic to superstition. And therefore put a much greater focus on the actual sort of like ethical component of Christian life. Or the salvatory, or the side of Christian practice, right? Focus on that and stop getting caught up in all of this goofy, superstitious white magic stuff. So all of these things are sort of happening together. The next step, next thing that again is again happening at basically the same time, right? As part of this effort to raise everyone's level of practice, there's a shift toward a neo-Stoic understanding of self. We get the development of through people like Descartes as an especially extreme version of it, but not just in him. It's sort of popularized and spreads far beyond Descartes, right? A kind of neo-Stoic sense of self. I must dominate myself, right? Or to say my reason must dominate my body and my emotions. Right? I must keep myself in control. At all times. One place where this spread sort of especially was in military circles, in military contexts, because indeed the disciplined soldier, right? That's why this is called sort of disciplinary society, the emergence of a disciplinary society. The disciplined soldier is a far better soldier than the undisciplined rabble. This also makes me a better worker, so this is desirable for economic reasons, but also for religious reasons. Now, this is new, though, because the goal had previously been not to constantly be waging war against yourself. The goal previously had been to live sort of a harmonious life with oneself, where you want the right things, you don't have to constantly be fighting yourself. Right? But indeed, this is a real achievement. And as an achievement, it's intimately connected with religion. And so as a result of all of three of these sort of various little factors we've been talking about, you start to get this equation between religious equals civilized. Right? These go hand in hand. To be religious is to be a civilized person, to be a self-controlled person, to be a good business person, to be a good economic subject. And so with this shift, right, we're increasingly shifting the focus away from any kind of focus on transcendence. The focus is increasingly moving toward mundane. These sort of mundane economic affairs, the affairs of state, start becoming what religion is ever increasingly sort of focused on. And so the eternal as well gives way. We stop seeing ourselves as connected to some sort of higher story or higher narrative. It's just the story of me as an economic subject. All right. Again, let's just pause for a second. How we doing? Everyone's still doing good? Any questions, any thoughts about any of this? Anything of the disciplinary society? All right. If we had more time, we'd read some Foucault to learn a little bit more about this particular time, because yeah, he's an excellent source for how much of what we take for granted would not have been taken for granted. The example that Taylor uses, and I just love it, in the 1500s, in the politeness manuals, I've said this before, but I just think it's continually just calls into mind how radical the change has been. This politeness manual of the 1500s suggested that it was probably in poor taste to pick up poop from the sidewalk and stick it in the face of your friend while commenting on its odor. Probably poor taste. Right? That needed to have been said in a politeness manual, right? Right? We're dealing with different people. Right? I mean, we can't almost imagine going back to it. We're all the inheritors of all of that hard work. The neo-Stoic self is the stuff works really hard, right? Disciplining himself, right? That's the whole point of it. We're the inheritors of this. We're now the selves that are more or less already disciplined, right? That we've been being disciplined from the time that we were young to be disciplinary in this way. We can't, but actually, like, I could easily imagine my 2-year-old nephew picking up some poop and sticking it in my face. Right? Like, I actually could imagine that, right? But we can't, because we're now from such a young age being disciplined, right? Gaining this sense of discipline, the sense of control. And this is intimately connected to the idea of religiosity, right? This sort of becomes part of what religion gives you, is this sense of self-discipline. And also, therefore, self-accomplishment, right? Being able to be disciplined in this way is something to be proud of. It's an achievement. It's an accomplishment. How are we doing? We good so far? Still good? All right. So as we've seen, compared to at least the Middle Ages anyway, the sense of religion is sort of diminishing a little bit. Like the focus is getting more and more narrow, more and more on daily sort of life, less and less on sort of these transcendent higher sources of meaning. Right? And again, this is especially true within Protestant contexts, but it's still true within the Catholic world too. It's just happening a little bit slower in the Catholic world, but it's still happening there as well. What's next? Next is deism. Right? So as a result of decreasing the role of transcendence, and as a result of all the various factors in disciplinary society, right, religion increasingly shifts, Christianity increasingly shifts in the direction of deism. And actually, this is even true of some of the movements. Taylor doesn't talk about this directly, but this even happens a little bit within some parts of Judaism as well, through figures like Benedict Spinoza, for example. Spinoza's not exactly a deist, but he's moving in that direction, and maybe he actually is a deist. It's super not clear, right? But so, but at the very least, certainly within Christian circles, thought starts to move in the direction of deism. Right? And deism has basically two big sort of pieces. First strand, right? God governs the universe impersonally. Right? Through natural laws, and of course, this is befitting a disenchanted universe. As befits a universe governed by natural laws, God just governs using those natural laws. God gets sort of, in a sense, depending on how you felt about the old religion, at least, right? The old Christianity, God becomes a mere clockmaker. Rather than sort of the active sustainer of every day, of every moment of every day. God sort of sets the clock in motion and then can stand back and just watch as it unfolds, as it does its thing. Right. Second, we get the idea of a sort of impersonal order, not just in terms of the governance of the universe, but also in terms of sort of ethics. God has sort of created the world such that if all of us just act on the basis of our sort of selfish, narrow self-interests, things are going to work out great. Again, we're here very much in the realm of the mundane here, right? What is my self-interest? It's just sort of treated as obvious that obvious my self-interest doesn't consist in a vow of poverty. Obviously, my self-interest is making as much money as possible, right? And paying my workers as little as I can get away with to do so. Got a question here. How would the deists explain miracles? Yeah, they would explain miracles by saying that there are no miracles. Yeah, I mean, basically. And again, it's not exactly like there are people who are running around calling themselves deists. This is more of a tendency in Christian thought. So what does this practically look like? People stop talking about miracles. They get talked about less and less and less. But you also do have some more extreme thinkers just straightforwardly say, like, yeah, miracles are stupid. They didn't happen. Right? They're not, miracles seem, maybe the resurrection. Like, again, we gotta be careful. Like, resurrection, maybe that one fine because that's somehow necessary to be Christian in the first place. But like, yeah, like everything else was just God sort of, or Christ playing some magic tricks to try to, get the local yokels on board. Right? All the sort of miracle stuff is sort of besides the point. Mm-hmm. And for the second point, right, maybe think like Adam Smith's invisible hand. If only everyone just acts selfishly like a good economic subject, right? Things are going to work out swimmingly for society as a whole. Right? All of society will be benefited, goods will go where they're needed, prices will be set at the correct levels, and as if by an invisible hand, right? So God sort of sets up the universe to work impersonally via the laws governing it, and also sort of by sort of the ethical rules governing it. And some of the more extreme thinkers even suggest that it's impossible for us to do anything else other than this. Right? That all we can do is sort of act on the basis of selfish self-interest. God is the only one who can be truly generous, who can be truly sort of charitable. The rest of us just need to sort of selfishly do us. And this shift doesn't last long. Right? There still is a place for God here. There remains a place for transcendence because we need God to set up the order. But once you get to this point, we can now easily imagine just cutting God out. Right? God doesn't do anything anymore. We can now just say, the world's just set up this way. Cut out this third point. Cut out God as the sort of clockmaker. Just make the universe be a clock that doesn't have a maker. That wasn't made by anyone. And so this sort of emergence of deism is what makes secularism possible. On Taylor's account. Right? This is where it becomes sort of thinkable. Because the religious has, in a sense, been reduced to such really, really narrow regions that it no longer plays any sort of crucial role. It becomes more and more irrelevant, even in the life of the Christian. That's the whole point. Like, everyone's Christians during this point, right? Like, Christianity itself becomes more and more increasingly irrelevant according to Christianity itself. Christianity itself is the one saying, order of mutual benefit, no higher vocations, no miracles, right? All of that, like, this is coming from religious motives, right? From this religion, this civilization, this economy, right? This equation, right? All of deism is coming out of that. It's making secularism possible. And this more or less takes us up to modernity, to the onslaught of the modern period. Deism collapses. There's not really much of a good reason to be a deist, really. So deism collapses. And in its place, you start to get all of the things we see in modernity. So you get scientific materialism, which just crosses out God from the deist universe. Deism without any transcendence, without any God whatsoever, right? And this is basically, the Richard Dawkins style atheist. Right? The Richard Dawkins style atheist today is basically an inheritor of this sort of view of scientific materialism. For him, it's maybe not Adam Smith's invisible hand, it's Darwin's natural selection. Fine, but that's indeed that's still, the hand governing the world. Right? Religion, on the other hand, so what we think of as Christianity, moves or should at least develop fundamentalist strands and also evangelical strands. So the rejection of the impersonalness of deism. And so therefore orienting everything toward an intensely passionate and personal relationship toward God. And again, this is what we see in tends to get called the religious right. The sort of evangelical religious right today is an inheritor of this, is an inheritor of the early Methodists and whatnot, who sort of reacted so vehemently against the shift toward deism. Right? But we also see all kinds of other things too. Right? These aren't the only two. These are sort of the extreme reactions, right? The ones that we sort of define modernity in terms of religion just basically becomes this, as we tend to talk, and religion gets opposed to science, where science is scientific materialism. And indeed, scientific materialism is not science, right? You could be a deist and still say all the same scientific conclusions as you were before, right? This is a particular stance toward how science is to be used, but nevertheless, all of science then gets associated with this and gets put at war with Christianity, which now just tends to increasingly mean this. But those are not by any stretch of the imagination the only options. There are indeed reactions against both of these. Right? You have, for example, Romanticism. Rejects the neo-Stoic sense of self as this sort of like self-discipline is sort of a violence against the self, and so looks for kind of unity. Okay. So harmony in all things, harmony in all places, both harmony interpersonally, but also harmony internally. I'm no longer to be at war with my emotions. Now my emotions have some crucial role to play. Maybe they have the privileged role. Maybe they are going to be the thing that's dragging reason around now. And indeed harmony also between human beings and the natural world. Right? So this is sort of neither, right? It's rejecting scientific materialism because of all the sort of impersonalness and the sort of self-discipline of the deist universe, but it's also rejecting the fundamentalist Christian because, again, it's sort of just two strands. This basically becomes just emotion, and this becomes cold reason. Reason versus emotion. No, we need to combine all those things. And we do it, though, in the context of Romanticism, not really toward any notion of transcendence, right? I mean, the highest thing, nature, becomes kind of this vaguely transcendent principle, but it's not really transcendent, at least not in anything like the way that the Christian God was. We also get the far more extreme sort of anti-enlightenment, postmodern positions start to emerge. In the most extreme version, and the one we've looked at the most in this class, Nietzsche, as a sort of especially extreme version that wants to fight back against the entire system of the disciplinary society itself. And indeed, where disciplinary society is just religion by another name. That's sort of Nietzsche's constant rejoinder. All of this atheism stuff that the deists or the scientific materialists are doing, it's all just God, but you've just changed God's name. You made it so that God, but now God is the state, or God is nature, or God is science, or reason, or truth. And all of those things are much less suitable to being God than just the Christian God was. The Christian God did the job of the Christian God really well. All of these sort of new sort of interjections just do the job worse. And so we read some Nietzsche. We saw sort of that thread. And then these are all more or less elites. During the 19th century, right? The average person is not really thinking of any of this. The average person is still just thinking the equation between civilization and religion, in effect. And indeed, the expansion starts to grow a little bit, right? It's not just civilization and religion that go together. It's morality and religion. It's patriotism and religion, right? All of these various things. And again, we see this today too. This is not, this should be things you still see, right? Within modernity as well, this equation, right? But even that changes as we continue to advance. Where all of these sort of various moves that were predominantly present amongst the educated elites become available to the average person during Taylor's age of authenticity. Now these are options sort of available to everyone, and the orientation starts to shift such that each individual is going to have to decide for themselves. What the meaning of life is. It no longer even makes sense to imagine conforming my beliefs to something that I'm not fully persuaded by. The way Taylor puts this, it's not just wrong to force people to have any particular set of beliefs. It's insane, like it's just contradictory, and so therefore it seems obscene. I love the way that he formulates that sort of transition. It really seems to capture the move. It's not just that it's wrong to make someone follow my religion. It's that doesn't even make any sense. Like everyone's going to have to find their own religion. Trying to force someone to my religion, then it's not just wronging them. It's an absurdity, and so therefore kind of an obscenity, some sort of gross violation or gross form of stupidity. And in this context, right, we've reached the point where to most of us, the transcendent has decreased more and more and more. And this came up actually in class. I think this was actually the last time we met, actually, before we had to do all this online stuff. We actually sort of finished the Taylor up, and several of you were just like, but this transcendence thing is just kind of stupid, right? Like, why would anyone possibly believe in this transcendence stuff? Right? As if it's just some sort of like crazy superstition left over from another age when people were dumber or something, right? And indeed, for many people, I think that's true. I think for many people, the idea of transcendence has become so thoroughly lost that you can't even really conceive of why you would ever believe in something transcendent in the first place. The idea of transcendence itself sort of becomes lost. And so this is the era in which secularism makes sense. So exclusive humanism, which indeed has its own set of problems, right? It's now become thinkable. It's now become a way that people can live because of the ever-escalating sense of the transcendent. Right? And the way Taylor sort of talks about this sort of dissatisfaction with it, though he always quotes the song lyric, "Is this all there is?" Right? That this exclusive humanist world just seems kind of empty. The world bereft of all transcendence seems kind of empty to people, even when they're in the process of living in it. But despite that, you might well find that preferable to a world of goblins and ghouls that just seems like crass superstition to you. Right? If it's this or crass superstition, of course you'll just have to grin and bear the inequities of life, right? And then you know, in more extreme versions, it becomes existentialism or something, right? Where indeed the dissatisfaction of life is part of life itself, and it's what makes life valuable in various sorts of ways and all that. Okay. So all of that's taking us through the Taylor. So we did sort of all of the. Is this all still good? There's also some stuff we've gone through before, but is the reminder helpful just to sort of refresh what we've sort of done? All right. This is why we've spent everything since the break talking about transcendence. Right? This is why I felt we actually needed to make this notion of transcendence actually intelligible to people. Because my guess is that for most people, it is not. Okay, so now we then turned to what is transcendence itself. Because no one in years past would have thought, or centuries past, would have thought they were just being irrational or superstitious by positing something transcendent. So why? What do they actually mean by transcendence? We turned to Nietzsche to help with us here, right? We saw in Nietzsche the idea of transcendence is positing the source of values or meaning in something beyond the sensible world, in a supersensible world. And so, you know, if, for example, I'm a early Christian, or maybe even better, if I'm someone during the Jewish diaspora in exile and throughout the Roman Empire, and I'm looking around and seeing myself kicked around by the authorities, bereft of a homeland, no power, no money, utterly poor, in order to say, wow, God really loves me. Nietzsche just thinks, yeah, you got to go beyond the apparent sensible world, right? There's the world you see, but there must be another world behind it, because in the world that you see, your life sucks, right? So if your life really doesn't suck, if, as you know, the sort of the master morality sense of just like, yeah, sucks to be you, right? If you're not going to say that, if it doesn't in fact suck to be you, there has to be some super sensible world that you're sort of finding value and meaning within, something beyond what's merely apparent. And for Nietzsche, this goes all the way. I mean, anything that goes beyond the mere appearances is a version of this. This includes Christian God, certainly. But it also includes, in a certain sense, things like the law of nature. You don't see the laws of nature, you see the effects of the laws of nature, but the laws of nature themselves are not sensible or apparent. Right? They are things you discover behind. And indeed, Newton says as much. Newton says it's not, the book of nature is written in mathematics. Right? And he goes back to Plato to try to justify all of this. Right? Or the value of truth, privileging truth above all else. Because why think that's the most valuable thing in the world? That's not obvious. That's not apparent. That's rooted in something higher. And this is part of Nietzsche's sort of this hatred of what he sees of as sort of the really shallowness of atheism. He sees modern atheism as just sort of shallowly preserving the structure of Christianity, just calling God by something else, right? Replacing God the Father as the source of all values, and you make nature the source of values, you make truth the source of values, or justice, or ethics, and you just preserve the structure. You just cut out God, but that's preserving the same transcendent structure. Right? And he calls all of this Platonism. Right? Where you ground the intelligibility of the world in something beyond the visible world itself. All right. So let's keep keep on going here. I'll stop again after doing a little bit of Platonism. Okay, so what's this Platonism thing then? Well, it came from Plato's effort to explain what he was seeing in the natural world, and he just thought the sensible world was explanatorily inadequate. To say he's entirely rational doesn't mean he's right. I mean, I actually do think he's right, but that's beside the point. It's like, that's not what I mean by rational. He's not doing this on the basis of any scripture or divine revelation or anything. He's just trying to be a good scientist, quite literally. I mean, in the modern sense, I guess. I mean, it's sort of a weird anachronism, but it's like, if anything, he's just trying to be a good student of the world. And Plato concludes that these sort of governing structures, they have to be transcendent to actually explain the way the sensible actually works. They have to be non-spatial and non-temporal, just like, for example, the laws of physics are not restricted to any particular spatial location, and non-temporal, and that they're not restricted to any particular time. They're present in all times and all places, and so therefore they can't be in any one time or any one place. Right? And so the super sensible world just is this non-spatial, non-temporal explanations. Only this is actually a bit of a misleading way of putting it. There is no sensible world, in fact. The sensible world is just an image or reflection of these transcendent principles. There's no two worlds in Platonism, right? There's just one world, and that one world gets expressed either well, and it gets understood well, or you understand it poorly. If you understand it in terms of the sensible world, you're going to be confused. If you understand it in terms of these things that he calls forms, you'll understand the world properly. And so indeed, yeah, Nietzsche's getting Plato wrong. He's mischaracterizing Plato just a smidge. Because there aren't two worlds in Plato. There's just the one. All right, and this gets taken up by the early Christian church. We talked about this recently enough, so I'll just sort of skim through this a little bit, right? We talked about, this gets taken up by the early various churches. And they use this framework, the Platonic framework, to articulate intellectually what's going on. The early Christian church fathers, sort of development of what we now think of as Judaism. What we think of as Judaism now is really a development of maybe like the 2nd century or so, and that really begins to many of those authors use some Platonic sources to help articulate things. Similarly, the early Islamic theologians, many of them use this sort of Platonic framework. All right. Okay, so if Taylor's right, then it turns out that what religion fundamentally means, transcendence just means, is being rooted in a kind of Platonism. Right? Some kind of Platonism, if we're to give some sort of rigorous account of what we mean by transcendence. Right? But there is another option. One that Plato himself actually endorses. We could define a religion not in terms of transcendence, right? Because that's sort of still a remainder from all that story that Taylor was telling us. He's defining religion still fundamentally in terms of the conflict between the sort of the secular humanists or the sort of scientific materialists and the sort of passionate and the faith, the blind faith of the religious. But the thing that Taylor's own account has shown is that that dichotomy is an arbitrary one. At least potentially, anyway. At very least, its dominance is the result of a historical accident. It would not have been the way people divided up the world in the Middle Ages, but it wouldn't have even been the way people divided up the world before that, or it's not the way people divided up the world in the Arabic world, as we saw when we were looking at how Islam characterized itself. It's not the way that the world would have been divided up in the Indian world, as we saw when we were talking about Buddhism. The Buddhists wouldn't have divided up the world in terms of this dichotomy, right? If indeed this is just potentially, at least, an arbitrary distinction, what's an alternative? What would be an alternative understanding? If this really is just an accident of Western European history, well, the alternative, as well articulated by Al-Farabi and Al-Ghazali and the Buddhist thinkers, a religion is the way of life of a people. The sort of orientation or instruction manual that all of us to some extent have received from society, in some rough sense of the word society, about how we can attain happiness, either as individuals or collectively. When you watch the Disney cartoon and the Disney cartoon talks about true love, and you're at a really impressionable young age and you're looking for true love as you go, Disney is part of your religion then. Disney is the founding myth of your orientations, really. At least one of the founding myths, along with George Washington chopping down the apple tree to make the world safe for democracy, and that buying the right Axe body spray will make women finally like you. Right? These founding myths are indeed the religion of the modern world, of the modern day, of the modern Western world. Whereas Islam is a different articulation of a system of how to be happy, instructions about how to go about it. Buddhism is a different one. Christianity in the Middle Ages, so medieval style Christianity was a way of life. Right? The alternative we are left with is that what we are calling religion is more properly described in terms of these ways of life. And that the framework, religion, scientific materialism, and then there's a bunch of stuff in between, that might just be a bad framework for understanding the world, one that will radically distort the world and cause us to misunderstand how we're living our own lives and how other cultures are living too. And that's one of the real dangers of this. When in the 1900s you start getting all of these European sociologists going to other cultures, they kept trying to find religions everywhere and instead just found ways of life. Right? And so they had to systematically misunderstand what it was they were seeing from other cultures. We have a chat question here. We'll probably end with the chat question for the day because I think I've already gone a little bit over. So modern religion in our society and sounds like it's like social conditioning. Social conditioning in a very broad sense, yeah, like in the sense of just like the way society is organized as a whole. The Greeks have this word nomos that just basically means like custom, but also habit, tradition, like all of that. Sure, if you understand social conditioning broadly enough, I think that's right. It's sort of the rules by which all of us sort of collectively, culturally gauge what's a happy life and what's not a happy life. Yeah, and so I think and I don't know about that's the psychological account of it, but the way sociologists, at least their accounts of religions, frequently do go very much in this direction, where religion just is sort of the sociological framework or fabric of a society. And then we'd have a very different discussion if that's the debate, right? If that's the debate, we're not going to be talking, so should I just have blind faith or things, or should I just have my rationality? We'll be having the discussion that Al-Farabi and Al-Ghazali were having, what's the best way of life? Or that the Buddhists were having, what is the best way of life? Is scientific materialism a better way of life than evangelical fundamentalism, than Nietzscheism, than? It's just a different conversation, right? And a different orientation toward the world. And so your task is to figure out which orientation is the right one. Should we have and there's others too, these aren't exhaustive. Is the Taylor Western transcendence orientation the right one? Is there something crucial being picked out by this distinction between scientific materialism, evangelical Christianity, and then there's a whole bunch of other stuff in between? Is that the right framework? Or is the right framework rather this framework of ways of life? Where scientific materialism is just one way of life amongst others and has no special privilege status. Not religious. There is no not religious on that other model. And that's your paper. That's and those aren't the only, that's not an exhaustive choice either. You can also come up with different sort of accounts and your own sorts of accounts furthering from that. But at least that's one fundamental question, anyway, that you could use to organize the paper. At least that was the one I was using to organize the class. Right. We're far over, so I'll stop for today. Thank you. We'll do a little bit of course overview-y stuff while I'll talk maybe a little bit more about some of this stuff in class on Thursday. Thank you all very much. We can chat for a few minutes if anyone wants to. Otherwise, I kept you far too long. So thank you very much, and I'll see you on Thursday. Have a great rest of the week.